Um, so thank you for joining us for our quarterly racial justice and anti-racism learning community as part of the Segal program. Zora, we're so honored to have you here with us for our session on Can We Just Talk, a study of talking about race and racism with students during COVID-19. Zora Haque is a research associate at the Heller School, but also she has been a part of the Segal team for the past 5 years and has helped us with our data and data analysis. And so Zora's gotten, maybe not to connect with you all as directly, but has read everyone's surveys over the last few years. And Zora, we appreciate that you wanted to bring your research and your co-authorship to Segal Fellows and really engage us in conversation today about talking about race and racism with students, for those of us who do that in our life and in our work, but also more broadly. So I will turn it over to you, Zora, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Susie. I appreciate it. And I'm very, very glad and lucky to get to do this today. As Susie said, I'm a data person behind the scenes with Segal, and I'm a part of the Center for Youth and Communities. So I've gotten to play that role with many evaluations that have looked at programs serving kids and communities and families. This project that I'm about to discuss is actually something that came out of my time that is ongoing as a student in the MPP program. I've been part-time chugging along for several years, and because of my interest in education policy specifically, I branched out of Heller as much as I love it and found myself in classes in the education program in the sociology department, and that led me to getting to do this research. So I am really excited to be here and to get to talk about it. And just to give a really brief, overview of the agenda, I've just introduced myself a little bit more. I'll present the research, and we'll pause for a few minutes if anybody has questions, and then we will do some breakout rooms. I can't see the grid view since I'm presenting, so if we're a smaller group, then we can just do a larger group chat. So I will go ahead and dive right in. So I'll be speaking specifically about higher education, since the study is one that took place at Brandeis and was with Brandeis undergrads. But I think that the themes that come up are applicable in all educational spaces, whether it's structured or unstructured. If we think specifically about the past few years, we all know that COVID has been a massive health crisis and health pandemic. It converged at a time where other racialized phenomenon were really intensifying. And so having these two quote unquote twin pandemics of COVID and this exposure of societal structures upholding racism in other ways through police violence, anti-Asian hate, lots of things happening, has intensified this public scrutiny of exclusionary practices that sustain racism and racial inequalities, and that includes those that occur and take place in colleges and higher education. A report published back in 2021 actually took a look at the statements that I believe somewhere around 300 schools issued following the murder of George Floyd, which was several months after the start of the pandemic. A survey was asked to administrators at these schools, and they were asked to describe what were the actions that you took after, not you, the administrator, the university, after first, making the statement. And I don't think that this will necessarily be a surprise to folks in the room, but only about 30 of those 300, so 10%, had actionable next steps for actively combating racial inequity. And the vast majority of those schools mentioned initiatives that related to expanding DEI initiatives, beginning DEI initiatives. Very few talked about actual pedagogical changes or shifting curriculum to use teaching and learning as tools for combating racial inequity. So with trends like that, happening in higher ed. Again, those are outside reports, has nothing, there's no connection with the study that I'm going to talk about. We can, expect that, unfortunately, at this point in time, most US schools aren't making curricular shifts. They aren't introducing pedagogy that addresses racism, even in light of the severe racial inequities that have been exposed over the past few years. So there are some reasons that we hear, and some that, don't get a lot of attention and maybe get pushed down as to why it is that this doesn't happen as much. Some simply believe it's too difficult to talk about race and topics that relate to race and racism in the classroom. It's uncomfortable. That's part of why it's important to talk about it. And I think that that's a theme that's going to come up frequently in this study and in this discussion. So, in order to really have robust anti-racist action in higher education, requires moving past public statements that we've seen issued by schools in the past few years, and those actions should include strategies of pointing to racial literacy and talking about race so that there's a discursive tool to acknowledge and understand and address racism, not just right now, but for years to come, hopefully always. So why it's important to talk about race and racism at college, I've touched on this a little bit already. The events that we've seen have made it really clear that racism is not just systemic and structural, but it's institutional, it's interpersonal, it's a part of all elements of our society. And it doesn't only manifest itself in these violent, outward, and explicit actions that come to mind when you think of racism, but it exists in other societal structures, including higher ed. It's one of many societal structures that's built off of white supremacy, and in that fact of itself, that's causing the system to reify racist structures, whether it's intentional or not. So providing students, not just students, but faculty and staff also with opportunities to develop discursive tools to talk about race and racism, get an understanding of how it operates within institutional structures, and then gaining strategies to address and mitigate these inequalities are all part of advancing racial literacy. Again, it's often uncomfortable to talk about, or people just don't know exactly how to do so in the classroom. If in an academic setting, take it outside into a professional setting, it still is a very novel thing happening in higher education. So the research in this study highlights the importance of teaching undergrads specifically to talk about race and racism as just one in a series of steps that are necessary for pursuing and sustaining anti-racism in higher ed institutions. So really quickly, the scope of the research in this study happened right here on campus. 2 different Brandeis courses that unfortunately won't be offered in the coming year because the professor is on sabbatical. He'll be away conducting very similar research abroad. If anybody in the room is a current student, these are great classes. I've taken one myself. One is Sociology of Education, and the other is Critical Perspectives of Urban Education. I was fortunate enough to convince this professor to let me take urban ed as a grad student, enhance the course for myself, and got to TA it for another semester, and just to be in the presence of students who really, really wanted to learn about these things was just a great thing to see, and is part of what led me here. So students in these 2 classes took surveys at the start of the semester and again at the end that asked them questions about their skills and their confidence in talking about race and racism. And the study itself wanted to take a look at the instructional approaches that you see on the screen that the professor applied during classes. So to accomplish those approaches, lectures were minimized, and he instead emphasized one-on-one small group, and class-wide discussions about race and racism in every single session. Through writing assignments and discussion norms that were modeled by the professor, taught by the professor and the TAs, the classes sought to help students understand how their own lives and educational experiences have been mediated by race. The importance of positionality was really emphasized in order to underscore the need to pay attention to one's own racialized social location. Students were asked to consider how, despite personal intentions, their own race mattered to their educational trajectories, not just during the COVID-19 pandemic, but before it as well. And I should clarify that both of these classes took place at the very start of, or not the very start of the pandemic, but they were underway as the pandemic picked up. So that's what made it really critical in being able to understand this in the scope of, this moment of crisis. So I believe we can jump into.
Zora,
Oh yeah.
can you get on that slide? Can you just say, I think I know what it means, but I don't want to assume. The second one, incorporating reflexivity into classroom assignments. Can you say what that means? What that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So students were given these classroom assignments to be a part of small groups that were both racially heterogeneous and race-based in terms of affinity groups. And that was one of a few different methods that were used to kind of encourage a sense of building rapport with one another. And in a lot of cases really was effective at helping folks identify common themes and trends and experiences and build that reflexivity that came out of classroom assignments. And then the same was applied in homework assignments and papers and things like that. Does that answer that question? It's possible I'm missing things because it's been some time, but the core of it was think about your positionality, who you are, what your identity brings, how it facilitates the way that you kind of navigate these conversations around education and how race and racism play a role in it. So we'll move to the findings, which is always the fun part. So I included significant scores and things like that for anybody with a data mindset. But the big finding here was that these assessments of skills, so the chart on the left, these skills related to discussing race and racism improved in a classroom setting from 70% to every single student at the end of the semester felt like those skills grew. And the confidence piece was, it's also still something that increased significantly, but you can see that it's not quite to the same extent as skills. For us, in the context of the study, we interpreted that to lag from the fact that students might require more practice engaging in conversations about race and racism before they might feel confident about doing that. And that really underscores the need for colleges, universities, and we can extend this again to other educational spaces to really embed this kind of conversational piece, this conversational pedagogy of using racial literacy early on and then continuing it throughout a student's time in school, throughout curriculum, to encourage this ongoing practice of talking about race and racism. If it's something that requires some more time, maybe it should start a little bit earlier on. So what do the findings mean for the higher ed system and beyond? We're seeing that undergrads benefited from this teaching that focused on building their capacity to talk about racism, to get comfortable talking about race and racism, more comfortable than they were, at least at the beginning of the semester. We can make the assumption that if that's true, that might be true for most young and youth and young people. Students of all ages are constantly consuming information about the events of the day, the week, the month. They don't always have the space to talk with peers in a structured, respectful, and informed manner. But this study and others that are out there that are similar to it really prove that they want to talk about race and racism because they live through it or experience it regularly. The realities of race and racism in the US are uncomfortable, and talking about it can be difficult to do, especially as young people entering a society today that more than ever is full of conversations from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. We've seen recent conversations and legislative movements around critical race theory, so many other things that there's just a lot of conversation around it and not necessarily enough space in the classroom to unpack what that means in general, and then what that means for students, what that means as a person entering society after college. So teaching about those realities in a way that allows that discomfort to happen while also moving past it towards a real understanding has the opportunity to help promote racial justice and prepare these future generations to be better equipped to tackle these issues that are unlikely to go away anytime soon. Incremental growth can happen, things can be chipped away at, but if there isn't a stronger sense of feeling comfortable in addressing these issues, it's only going to be more difficult, and that won't be as possible. So there's a lot within education and a lot more outside of education that I think these findings can point to. So that is where I'll stop for now, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know this was a very, very brief overview of the study itself. There's a lot in it. I can't talk about all of it in one sitting. I wish I could, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has right now.
While people are thinking of some, I hope it's okay, Zora. I know we talked about some of the findings last week, as you were preparing for this. The slide about the results, I think you said that was not able to be broken down across students' race and ethnicity to look at it further due to anonymity concerns. Is that right?
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. We did keep surveys anonymous because while these classes were both somewhere between 30-35 students per class, they were still small enough to, folks could be identified if that kind of information was gathered. So there wasn't an ability to look at the kind of crosstab themes across race, ethnicity, other factors. But the class was generally representative of the Brandeis undergrad demographic population. So that's kind of a basis, a baseline point for being able to get a sense of where certain themes might be coming from. Did I just see a hand up?
Yes, you did. It was mine. The question I have is, and this is probably more of your opinion than actual research and data, but do you think because it was a course wrapped in race, like the whole point of the class was to talk about race, did that have an effect, do you think, on the data that you saw? Because those numbers are pretty significant, right? I saw from 30 to like 70%. So I'm just wondering if you think that particular class saw an increase because they were constantly talking about race, or if it was having certain things in place in any classroom setting could ultimately lead to data similar to what we saw here.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. It's a really good question. We absolutely consider the fact that students chose to take this class. There's self-selection in that decision making. the professor does this every semester, but actually starts the first day of class saying, I'm going to talk about race and racism every single class. You need to be comfortable with that or be willing to address that discomfort. In the class that I took, in the class that I TA'd, we saw numbers drop off by somewhere between 7 and 10 folks left the class. And it's interesting to think about and kind of see that, you know, having a number attached to that. Obviously, you know, that's not necessarily representative of everybody out there of what, you know, you might see in willingness to talk about these kinds of things. But yeah, anybody who's in the class, they've already got some degree of a vested interest in this kind of topic. Thank you for asking that.
I have another question. It's been some years since I've actually been on the Brandeis campus. Does Brandeis have some of that anti-pedagogy in place for its faculty members to kind of incorporate in their classrooms? Or is it just this particular professor and maybe a few across campus? But is there already something in place at Brandeis that could be part of the culture that kind of help this along outside the classroom?
Actually, yes. Thank you for asking that as well. I don't know the full scope. I'm sure that there are other initiatives taking place, have taken place recently, but I've worked with this professor quite a bit over the past couple of years, and we conducted some research last year, I think it was, that involved working with some Brandeis undergrads who worked alongside in developing some ideas for policies to bring into place at Brandeis. And they actually held a workshop at Heller last fall, I believe it was, to speak from their position as Brandeis undergrads and how they benefited from this class, from being RAs on projects that also did, you know, studies of race and racism themes in education specifically outside of this study, you know, kind of born out of a series of other studies. So I unfortunately didn't get to attend that myself, but I heard that, you know, it was effective and fun. And the scope of it was to hold this workshop session for grad students at Brandeis who wanted to TA for professors across the university and bring those skills into the classroom and kind of collaborate in saying, you know, here are some practices that were effective for these students. So let's see what we can do to make it a little bit more widespread. Thank you.
If I could jump in here and just add on that, during one of the things that I was provost at Brandeis when COVID hit, and one of the things that we did in the summer of 2020, as everyone was learning how to pivot into online learning, faculty had an opportunity to get a grant for doing digital learning skills developed out of our Center for Teaching and Learning, but where the focus of much of that discussion was how to have a more inclusive pedagogy and to address issues of equity in the classroom, as we were trying, as Zora talked about, to address the dual pandemics that we were facing at the time. And
Thank you, Lisa.
Hi, Zora. Thank you for this information. Really appreciate it and really good seeing you. I think we're hearing a connection about the leadership that's in the room. And Zora, you just shared how the professor pretty much came in and said, hey, I'm going to talk about race. I'm going to talk about it every day. I'm going to be consistent with talking about race. And that definitely changed and shifts people's influence folks to act is in, I'm going to decide to stay in this classroom, or I'm going to decide not to take this class. From your research, were you able to gather information from the students to see how much of an influence the professor was on their thought process and the way that they approach the classroom. Because you told us that the syllabus kind of had to adjust, the classroom adjusted. So it was also becoming uncomfortable for the professor based off of their typical format of their classroom to now a different conversation, which also is giving them an I do, we do, you do of like, we're going to do this together. We're going to adjust. I'm going to adjust my classroom because we're also going to adjust our positions in having these conversations. Were you able to capture any of any knowledge or gathering research from the students' perspectives about the influence the professor made?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Bria. So there was a very big intention with from the professor. So Duran Wallace is the professor of these two classes, and he is fully aware and takes this into account when he teaches these classes, when he conducted this research. It matters who the teacher is when it comes to the willingness of participants to be in the class in the first place, to want to engage in it. It's just the way that it is. So in the case of this course, having a Black professor, having a Black male professor was absolutely influential on the engagement of students in the classroom, on who may or may not have felt the most impacted, the most empowered to participate actively. There isn't anything in the study that we were able to capture. We unfortunately didn't get the chance to ask any open-ended questions. They were these kind of scale questions. If I'm to speak from my position, again, as someone who took the class at one point, who TA'd and spent a lot of time in office hours with students who were trying to grapple with the frameworks for discussing race, for understanding race. There absolutely were anecdotal moments of learning and becoming attuned to the influence of everybody in the classroom, including the professor, including myself, including other TAs in the classroom. And it's absolutely something that is influential on the extent to which somebody, again, is invested in the class and the topics, retains the information, applies it. One thing that was really great to see come out of the classroom is that a lot of these folks created coalitions outside of class and on campus to address these issues beyond this one class that they took. So I think that says it all, right? There's a lot of impact that something like this can have, even if it's just one class for one semester. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
I just want to add, to build on something that Bria, that you just raised, is so important, on as you're thinking in a classroom situation, how you create that environment for these discussions and conversations and growth to happen. And I think what Professor Wallace is really he's extraordinary on multiple dimensions, but what he is particularly good at is that he's willing to adapt and to change and not to be rigid. This is this reflection component that Zora talked about in her points. And you see that, I think, in my experience of looking at who were the faculty who really I felt did the best in terms of really creating an environment in which all voices could be heard within the classroom. The first voice that they had to deal with was theirs as a professor, to not be so dogmatic and so rigid. And this is the curriculum, and I developed this. I mean, I see this when I work in K through 12 situations where, you have your teaching plan, you have the things that you're supposed to teach, and you're not allowed that freedom to react to something that happens in the class. So, how we create, in our teaching and reward good teachers who are willing to step back and let the students step in. It's not the way that, traditionally people have been educated to be as a teacher. But I think it really just changes the dynamics, the power dynamics in particular in the classroom. And that's like the first step. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a first step, I think, to have some of the outcomes that Zora shared with us.
This will be my last question, I promise. So what were from your viewpoint, some of the limitations of the research that you've done, in particular with this particular topic? One, because I'm in an MBA program right now and I'm doing data, and it's the worst part of my entire existence right now. So I've just read a chapter on limitations, but I recognize that you mentioned, it was a anonymity, so you don't know if it was primarily white students who said they felt like they were more confident about talking about race, or this particular classroom. And also because I'm in New Hampshire and we're super close to each other, thinking about other college campuses and the dynamics of that, as well as I think Lisa had mentioned, thinking about the staff and the student body at Brandeis a bit more progressive, using air quotes, progressive in their thought process. And that would seem something to balance that out. But wondering, is there any limitations to what you've seen, or where you want to expand this particular research, whether it's on Brandeis campus or otherwise other campuses?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. If I've learned anything from, this study and other research that I've been a part of, there are always so many limitations and things that you look back and say, man, I really wish I did X, Y, and Z and added this in. So absolutely, being able to have a bigger sample is always nice. You can get a broader sense of more kind of granular things, because having that bigger sample makes it more possible to draw out, significance patterns when you're then, say, breaking it down by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by age, by maybe class year in this case. So the sample size, if we could survey every single student every single year, that would be amazing. And I don't know if something like that is even feasible, but if it were, that would be great. And yes, I mean, having this study taking place at Brandeis in Massachusetts, a liberal state, Brandeis being again, quote unquote, a progressive school. We're taking the self-selection back and, bringing that back into the picture, who's actually in this class. I would love to see studies similar to this happening at, I'd love to see results from this at schools on the West Coast, schools in the South, schools in the Midwest, and to be able to kind of do this big national comparison. I've seen some studies outside of the US, and I will actually say that the paper that was born out of this study was published in a journal. It's an international education journal. And this is exciting to be able to say, but it's the only paper from the US that was published in it. So there's a reason why, if you are someone who likes to, who likes to, read these kinds of studies, you will see in the paper it is consistently saying US schools, US colleges and universities. And I think that that's important to contextualize regardless, because the nature and dynamics of race and racism in the US are very it's unique, to use that kind of language. But I might have gotten a little bit lost in that question, because I just really went on a little tangent there. Did I answer that?
Sorry, anybody else want to hop in? Can I ask another question, a related one? Because I think the other thing I'm thinking about too is, so, part of what you were just saying is all the ways you'd like to shape this research going forward. And another piece that I'd be really interested in is, what does it look like when a white faculty member comes in and starts every class and says, I'm going to talk about race, racism, and equity in everything that we're going to discuss here. I mean, I was thinking about that, and if I was sitting in the class, I'd be like, and what are you gonna say about that? Looking at somebody like me, thinking about doing that, but I would also be really interested from the faculty side, so of faculty of different races coming in that way, and looking at that through a gender lens too. I mean, the whole possible combination of those things, because I think those other things in general, without using the statement about racism and race, I think we know we have the body of research that shows that different types of faculty members are seen as credible, not credible, fair, not fair, like all sorts, competent, not competent, based on those differences, right? So we've got that set up. And then I'm coming in and I say, all right, you know, this is going to be a classroom that comes out of justice and anti-racism work. And, you know, what does that mean when I say that versus when Duran says that? So anyway, that's my 2 cents on how you can write your dissertation when you get to it.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, it's a good point. I absolutely think that there, you know, I can speak from my experiences as a college student and as a grad student. It makes a difference on you know, feeling welcome to discuss certain things in the classroom, given the identity of the person standing in front of you. And it's one of the things that I loved from the findings here is the learning about the sense of empowerment that a lot of students expressed they felt from being in this class. And again, I wish that these were in the study findings, but I think back to, again, my own experiences and hearing students say, you know, just speaking Professor Wallace's praises and saying he is so unapologetic in talking about these topics. And that was something that was really encouraging to folks. And you of course wonder, you know, this is one person. How would this look like if any other professor did this, any other Black professor did this, any other, you know, Asian professor did this, East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, a white professor. So lots more research to be done.
And along with what you've raised, Zora, and what everyone else has raised, and I saw Bria, you chatted in different departments and also same pedagogy, same people, but class descriptions that maybe weren't, or titles that weren't as explicitly about race, but should be bringing it into every conversation too. But it would also be so fascinating, I'm not saying this is doable, to be able to continue to survey these students that were surveyed as they go into other classes and see in which classes this confidence in these skills continue and where they don't. So it's hopefully more research will be done. I'm going to stop talking because I know you wanted people to talk to each other.
Thank you, Susie. I had the same thought, and then it got lost in all the other thoughts that I was having as people were bringing up such wonderful points. I always love something that's has some kind of long-term longitudinal movement in a study. So to be able to follow folks would be really, really great if that were possible.
And now y'all have my wheels turning per usual. I'm even thinking, because I work with the university systems in Georgia, our perspective in talking about race will look different based off of the context of the South. And so where I'm thinking about conversations like this might start is the civil rights movement. And how do we even get to those different points, and even talking about our history when also moving forward. But even with your research, which I'm curious about, Zora, is were the topics about the now or the past or the future?
It was all of it.
It was all of it. Okay, because I think that helps because it was a classroom, so you had a
Mhm.
series of instruction and time together, which I think based off certain areas, some areas like the South, I think will need a lot more time, and a number of classes. Because I'm even thinking about my students that go to Spelman and Albany State, they get these conversations consistently because of the space that they're in as being at an historical Black college or university. And
Mhm.
so with this being in Brandeis, it's a different group of people. So how are we having the conversation so that we all are on one plane to have the conversation? So even thinking about the different educational structures, or even if you had time to think about it, or maybe not, but that's kind of where my brain is going, is like, this is progress, and I really appreciate the work that you've done with this, and it's where can we go, or how can we use it to inspire or spark another conversation nationally.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with you. It's, yeah, again, my mind is hoping and just really, really wants to see this kind of research spread. And I know that there are folks out there doing very similar work, and I hope that it just continues to go along those lines. So absolutely. The nice thing about this class, both of these classes, was having that intentionality on historical context. One of the classes was specifically on urban education across the US and talking about race and racism in that context. Sociology of education, the other class, also had an education focus. So these are very specifically talking about the trends and history of how race and racism have shaped educational structures, experiences, all those good things. So to be able to apply that and then have these classes happening during the pandemic, this is a professor who, again, very quick to adapt, wanted to pull in conversations around what's happening with COVID right now, what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what's happening with all of these things, and how is it impacting your educational experiences and just the general shape of what higher ed looks like right now. Thank you.
Appreciate that. It's bringing the whole student to the classroom as well.
Absolutely. Aren't any other questions? I mean, we've covered a lot of bases, which is really wonderful. And we're a small enough group where we could, not need to break out into groups, but there are some questions that I was going to pose, and I think that some of these, I actually don't know what time it is, but depending on how much time is left.
We have 3 or 4 minutes left, depending, facilitate the way you'd like, but I'm also happy to offer to email these questions out to all the participants so people can do some individual reflection too, if it ends up not having time for group reflection.
Yeah, if folks want to react to anything here, the initial plan, was if there are people in the room who have an education hat, whether that's formal or informal education, there are some questions specific for those folks, and then some other questions as well. But if any of these speak to you, please feel free to react. And since we also are short on time, if not, if we can't fit it in, then, oh yes, go ahead, Damon.
Yeah, I'm a fast reader when I need to be. But I will say this, I really appreciate all this, and the question on the room to educators of like, have you experienced this? It made me think of most of everyone on this call knows my wife, and we did a Saturday school for students where we did very similar, talking about different issues, LGBT, race, disabilities, and all that. And in partnership with the school district and the chief equity officer here in the school district, thinking about how do we bring what you've presented today to K through 12 in a way that isn't, I'm going to say this and we all know that it's not, but making sure that it's not CRT that's happening in our K through 12 schools. But how do we have conversations to make sure students are full rounded? And as Bria said, the whole student, because you can't just leave like your Blackness at the door or your, whatever at the door to come in and get an education. And I'm wondering how adaptable the research is to K through 12, and how do you do what Lisa said, right? You're hoping to use some honey to like bring them in, but you also know you have to push them a little bit. Because in my role, I work for a nonprofit that works with the school district. And so a lot of our suggestions are just that, suggestions. We can't really make them do anything. But I think based on your research here and based on my personal experiences with students, that those types of conversations actually make the student a better student academically, but also socially. And how do you prove that to people who may not see race, one, but then also see that there may not be a racial issue in their community or school? How do you bring those type of conversations? And so that's where I am now. I'm trying to like, all right, I need to connect Zora with Tina so that she can come and help write a survey. So my brain is doing the same thing your brain was doing, Zora, of like, okay, now that I have all this new stuff, what can I do with it? Because I think your research here and the topic itself is something that I'm quite passionate about. And I think a lot of the students in the school district I do work in, and yes, I am in New Hampshire, it is still white, but a lot of the students are students of color. How do we bring those types of conversations without them feeling like they have to own a conversation about race, but then also feel like they can participate in a conversation about race and feel that there's some movement? Because right, in schools, we know you may go to the principal and say, the water fountain's broken, but like that's the end of the conversation and it may never get fixed. And so how do you have conversations with students about an issue so personal that they can sense some movement in that? And so I just wanted to say a lot again, thank you for your research. And I look forward to seeing more of it and then potentially connecting with you and some folks who actually do this work as their real job all the time, to make this a fruition for K through 12. Because I think K through 12 education, they want it, they just don't, no one wants to do the work to like make it happen. So if they can have research and data to show like, oh, changing your pedagogy would help all your students, they would be on board with that. And I don't think there's the research out there that says clear cut, this would help students. And I think your research kind of shows that it does.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that so much. And I'm always so happy when there's somebody else in the room with, their mind brimming with thoughts like this constantly. So I love that. And I will actually say that part of why I appreciate your comments is that I actually just this morning was reading a paper that was recently published talking about, it didn't do quite the same kind of study, but it did. I'll have to find it. Maybe I can send it to Susie and she can share it with folks. But there was a conclusion that was drawn saying that children, so K through 12 students who have the opportunity in some capacity to talk about race, racism, related issues in the classroom, actually are shown to succeed academically as a whole. So there it is. And hopefully more people will keep, studying this and continue to prove that over and over again, because it seems to be that, repetition of findings is what really helps to really pound in certain elements into structures. And I don't think this is any different. So thank you again.
I'm definitely happy to email that out, Zora. So feel free, whatever slides you want to share from today, and also other articles. And we can all email each other too with other articles that are out there that show the evidence and the power of anti-racist pedagogy in schools. I know that a couple people had to hop off. And I'm so glad, Zora, that you got to share these questions, because I know you put a lot of thought into thinking about what we could reflect on together. And I hope we can continue these conversations over email. I'm also happy to stay on for a couple minutes if folks want to stay on, but I do know at time. And so I just, before other folks hop off, wanted to thank you again, Zora. Really appreciate you, all that you've done as a part of the Segal team for the past 5 years, but also joining us in our racial justice and anti-racism learning community to talk about this article. It's great. Everybody who was on this call has either helped create and kick off our learning community or is leading one of our affinity spaces. And I know there were folks that said they're going to watch the video later. So I'll turn the closing words over to you, Zora, but just want to thank everybody for joining us for the ongoing learning community on racial justice and anti-racism that we have among Segal Fellows. And thank you, Zora. So I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Susie. I'm so glad that I got to do this, and I appreciate everybody who's here for joining and for listening to me ramble about this study that I'm completely obsessed with and can't wait to do more similar work. It's exciting for me to, when I step into my Segal role again, to be able to put faces to names that I'm so familiar with. So that's always fun, and it's very inspiring to be among folks who care about the same issues as you do, and really are striving to make an impact in some way, shape, or form in some capacity, wherever it is. It's wonderful to be in this room right now. So thank you all.